What is the most cost-effective tuning measure you can make on your e-bike to significantly boost your comfort and overall well-being while riding? Adjusting contact points like the saddle and cockpit is key to greatly enhancing comfort and overall ride experience. In this video, we'll be discussing how to properly set up the cockpit, your e-bike's very own command center. So a warm and enthusiastic hello to you wonderful rebikers out there. In this informative tech tutorial, we're going to explore how you can correctly adjust the steering center on your e-bike. And you'll immediately see it, the YT decoy that is positioned just to my left. Its central control system has been intentionally set up to be completely incorrect for demonstration purposes. The handlebar is noticeably crooked and of course entirely misaligned. So, what we need to do now is meticulously adjust and align the stem and all the controls at the cockpit area on this particular bike. Let's examine this one step at a time. One thing is certain, effective work on the e-bike rises or falls with the appropriate tools, and I've got a small selection right here in front of me, and I'll begin with the essential equipment, the Allen key set. Of course, the majority of screws you'll find on bicycles are Allen screws, which means having a robust Allen key set is really the fundamental starting point in any toolkit. However, it is indeed the case that we have installed some very sensitive components in the cockpit area because, of course, the handlebar is a highly safety-relevant component. Thus, it is extremely important that we do not over-tighten the screws that clamp the handlebar in the stem. At the same time, they must be adequately tight to ensure that the handlebar is securely held in the stem and does not slip even under high force, for example, on an E-mountain bike when applying the brakes. Then the handlebar really needs to be clamped down very securely. However, it should not be tightened excessively because applying too much pressure through over-tightening could lead to damage of the materials involved, such as crushing or deforming the handlebar in the clamping area. And how can you avoid that sort of issue? Well, naturally, you can do so by employing a torque wrench, which allows you to preset and ensure the exact level of torque applied when you tighten the screw, making sure that when the appropriate torque is reached, the wrench will slip, ensuring that the screw does not continue to be tightened too much, effectively preventing any chance of over-tightening. A torque wrench of this kind, I can genuinely and wholeheartedly recommend to each and every one of you. It's definitely important, not just for the handlebars, but also for numerous other types of screws. This helps prevent over-tightening screws in general, which could lead to damaging the thread, for instance, and to just play it safe and securely tighten all the screws on the wheel without any damage. Yes, a torque wrench is worth its weight in gold. There are, of course, a variety of attachments available for hex bits, just like for Torx bits, and the most common, widely used Torx on a bike is, without a doubt, the T25, which is this particular one right here. And we're going to need that for adjusting the cockpit shortly. For instance, on the bolts of the stem, but also on the bolts of the brakes. Particularly the company SRAM typically installs Torx screws on shifters and brakes, meaning they don't use any Allen screws. That's why pay attention to which components are installed and from which manufacturers. Shimano, for example, usually has Allen screws, while SRAM always uses Torx screws. And then you'll see right away, okay, there's a SRAM brake, so I'll need a Torx wrench. So let's get started and begin on. Yes, and as I mentioned in the introduction, quite a few things are incorrectly adjusted on this bike. I've organized it in such a way that we can carefully and systematically go through all of the setup steps one by one. We begin by properly aligning the handlebars in the stem, considering both the centering position and the rotational angle. Afterwards, we then adjust the height of the cockpit, which can be set using the spaces located either above or below the stem. After that, we of course align the stem properly in the middle, centering it perfectly in line with the front wheel. And once that's done, once the foundation is set and the handlebars and stem are properly fitted, then it's time to focus on the controls, such as the brake and shift levers, as well as the remote controller for the motor and the dropper post. And in the end, we'll have a perfectly ergonomically adjusted bike. And when you do this on your own bike, you will straight away notice just how much the riding position, the seat position on the bike is noticeably more comfortable. This naturally has a substantial impact on the bike's handling, because if, for example, the handlebars are incorrectly turned. If it's turned too far back, so that the so-called back sweep, meaning the handlebar's backward bend, ends up pointing downwards, you might find yourself in a very uncomfortable and awkward wrist position. If, for example, this so-called back sweep, meaning the backward bend, points downward, then this often leads to your elbows staying much closer to your body rather than jutting out as they typically might otherwise. However, what's truly incredibly important, especially when cycling off-road, is that having your elbows out actually creates the necessary space for movement, which is essentially the apparatus for fluid motion, that I can then actively utilize while riding on the trail with the bike, enabling me to personally absorb and cushion impacts and actively steer the bike through various dynamic loading techniques. Can move the terrain. However, if the arms are resting close to the body, then I'm blocking my own movement mechanics, which is closely related to the cockpit, meaning the correct handlebar setup. That's why it's incredibly important. The same principle applies to the brake levers, because if these are not properly adjusted, it can easily result in uncomfortable arm pump issues, particularly during long downhill rides. Also to a hardening of the forearms. That's why it's so important that the cockpit is properly adjusted overall. So, enough with all the talking, let's get started with the setup process. First and foremost, it's really crucial to accurately center the handlebar in the stem. To assist you in finding the exact middle, you'll notice that most handlebars actually have a handy scale on them, which is located here in the stem clamping area, usually engraved with a laser. On carbon handlebars, it's printed, and with this scale, you can see if the handlebar is centered in the stem. You could also have that printed on other items, for instance, right here on the E13 handlebar that we have specifically installed here. In the center here, an E13 marking is visible, appearing as a laser engraving. And if that's exactly centered between the two clamps of the stem, then the handlebar is also positioned centrally in the stem, so that on both sides, to the left and to the right, the handlebar, to ensure it looks the same on both outer sides, that's step one, centering the handlebar within the stem. Then it's about aligning the handlebar correctly. Each handlebar is designed with its own unique ergonomics. There's the back sweep, which refers to the handlebar's backward curve, specifying the exact number of degrees by which the handlebar is bent and curving backward from the specific point where it is securely clamped onto the stem. Very common here, for example, is the handlebar sweep with a 12-degree angle. This is a handlebar angle that proves to be extremely ergonomic, especially for those riders who enjoy covering extensive distances on a mountain bike. On the other hand, for those who prefer to adopt a more aggressive riding style and be particularly active with the bike on challenging rugged terrain, many opt for a slightly reduced angle, typically around 8 or 9 degrees of handlebar angle. This sweep should indeed always be a back sweep rather than ever being a down sweep. That means the handlebars should not be turned backward so that the bend goes down, but they should really direct backward. Under particular circumstances, since exceptions are widely known to prove the rule, the handlebar bend is actually allowed to point upwards. For instance, if you tend to favor maintaining a specific posture on the bike where you're leaning substantially over the handlebars and reaching downward with your arms, it might make perfect sense to adjusting this handlebar back a little bit further upwards so that it effectively acts like a kind of wing or an airfoil, subtly pointing upwards. Not every handlebar, but most of them are designed with a rise, which is essentially a bend indicating the height. This refers to how many millimeters the handlebar actually curves in an upward direction from its central point, the so-called rise. In this particular instance, it's a rise of 30 millimeters, meaning the handlebar elevates by a total of 30 millimeters upward from the central point. Okay, now I'm aligning these handlebars with the stem. First, as I mentioned earlier, I position them in the center of the stem, ensuring they're perfectly aligned. Then I inspect the handlebar sweep angle. And when I observe the handlebars from the side, then the handlebar's backward bend should actually go back, and the handlebar's upward bend should go up. Then the handlebar is correctly and well adjusted. Once the components are properly and precisely adjusted, such as the handlebar we've just aligned in the stem, the components are then properly tightened with the Torx wrench You can of course do it with the Allen wrench, but as I said, I definitely recommend the Torx wrench, particularly with safety critical parts like the handlebars. So you're set the torque on the wrench beforehand. Where do you find the torque? It's usually printed on the stem bolts, otherwise of course in the user manual. For this specific stem, each of the 4 screws needs to be carefully alternated and then tightened to exactly 6 Newton meters to ensure proper assembly. You always go in a crisscross pattern, starting from the top right, then moving to the bottom left, followed by the bottom right, and finally the top left. Tighten screws using a crosswise pattern, doing so gradually. Avoid using full torque initially, start with half, increasing it steadily over at least 2 further steps to ensure proper and even securing. Optimal is to tighten the screws in 3 steps, one after the other. Since the handlebars are now firmly seated in the stem, I can already sit on the bike and start getting a feel for it. Whether the cockpit height is genuinely suitable for my needs. So whether the handlebars are positioned correctly or if they're perhaps too low, making me feel overly bent forward, or if I am sitting too upright, which would make the handlebars too high. If the handlebars are too high, then I can check if there are still spaces under the stem. I can then swap them from bottom to top, meaning I take them out from underneath the extension and place them on top of it. This causes the cockpit to slide downwards, and I also lower my upper body slightly. Of course, it works the other way around too. If I feel like I'm sitting too low with my upper body, I can place spacers which are already on top of the stem underneath the stem. With the stem then moving up and my seating position becoming a bit more upright. Once that's done, the subsequent step involves carefully aligning the stem, ensuring that it is perfectly centered and aligned in such a precise manner that it remains in a direct and straight line with the front wheel. Very important in all these tasks are the stem bolts, meaning the bolts clamping the stem onto the steerer tube. They are of course loose, allowing the stem to turn easily. And before we move forward to clamp the stem firmly onto the steerer tube, meaning before effectively tightening the stem bolts, it is crucially important to make sure that the headset is properly adjusted. Because through adjusting the headset, we actually define the exact play of the headset bearings, which is essentially the headset itself. And this happens through the central bolt, which sits here at the top in the middle of the fork steerer. And when we go to tighten this bolt, we effectively clamp the headset securely in place. We achieve this by carefully and gradually tightening the bolt on the top cap situated here at the very top, until we feel that there's absolutely no more play in the steering bearing. It's really important to remember not to over-tighten it here, as this could damage the components. We don't want to jam the steering bearings. It shouldn't be tightened to the max, because over time the bearings would suffer from that. We want the steering head bearing to move smoothly and with ease, having no resistance, but also with no forward or backward play whatsoever. And you can test this quite effectively by firmly pressing the front brake and then securely grabbing the top part of the headset or the steering bearing section with your other hand. With the brake properly engaged in this manner, simply move the front wheel back and forth a bit. And then you'll quickly notice if anything's wobbly, if something feels loose, or if everything is securely in place yet still turns smoothly and without any resistance. Then you have precisely the correct preload for the headset. And once that's achieved, you can subsequently tighten the clamp bolts of the stem on the steerer tube, effectively clamping the stem securely onto the steerer tube. The handlebars and stem are properly aligned and already tightened, and will move directly to the controls on the cockpit. And we'll start with the brake lever. It's important to first take a look at what type of brake levers are actually installed. Is it a 2-finger lever or a 1-finger brake lever? The majority of modern disc brake systems nowadays typically have 1-finger levers installed. That means you can achieve full braking power with just 1 finger, specifically your index finger. Accordingly, the brake lever should also be adjusted so that it lines up optimally with your index finger. You shouldn't reach too far inward with your index finger. Likewise, the brake lever must be correctly adjusted in such a way that when you're actively engaging the brake lever, there is no strain. While pulling the brake lever, it shouldn't press on your middle finger, because that would be painful, and B, you'd be blocking your own braking force. Therefore, position the brake levers inward until you can comfortably reach and touch the outermost point of the lever with your index finger. Absolutely, the very outermost point of the lever is where you achieve maximum leverage. With a longer lever arm, the exertion of force becomes substantially more significant. So, gently push the brake lever inward until your index finger is perfectly aligned with the outermost point of the brake lever. And that's precisely the spot where the brake lever needs to remain. Following that, we'll proceed to adjust the angle of the brake lever, and it's crucial to remember that there are two distinct preferences for this setting. On one hand, there's the preference to adjust the brake levers so they fit optimally when standing over the bike, which is especially crucial during downhill riding. This is particularly important during descents or generally when navigating challenging terrain with an active upright body stance. Alternatively, some prefer to set their brake levers for the more traditional seated riding position. If you ride tours and cover long distances often, then you're typically sitting much more than standing on the bike. That's why it's recommended to adjust the brake levers for a sitting riding position for an ergonomic sitting posture here. Anyone who predominantly engages in riding downhill or seeks the optimal performance of their bike downhill, just like an experienced enduro rider, and wants to avoid arm pump, should set their brake levers correctly for the standing position. Let's start with the seated position. You're sitting on the bike, reaching forward with your arms, and now the following should not happen. The brake levers definitely shouldn't form a perfectly straight line along with your forearm and palm. This is because if you encounter bumps or hits coming from the front or from below, there's a good chance that it could result in your wrist being locked in this rather awkward position. A wrist is simply a joint, and a joint really needs a specific angle to be able to rotate properly and function as intended. That's why it's very important to tilt the brake levers just a little bit so that the wrist is positioned in a slightly angled manner here. This ensures it remains unobstructed and can effortlessly absorb vibrations and shocks coming from below in a relaxed manner. Set your brake levers so they are in a higher and flatter position, ensuring optimal performance in every riding condition. A slight bending at the wrist occurs. Should you prefer adjusting the brake levers for a more comfortable standing ride position, then I suggest you leave the brake levers loosely fitted. Leaning against a wall while on your bike, standing securely on the pedals, and experimenting by gently adjusting the loose brake levers a bit to determine which position feels the most comfortable and suits your style the best. And in this position, the brake levers are then appropriately tightened. Once more, it is extremely crucial to pay very close attention to the Torx settings that are specified by the manufacturers for those screws in this case. And it's highly recommended, in particular for E-mountain bikers who frequently venture off-road, to ensure that the brake levers are tightened just enough so that they do not slip on their own accord, but still remain loose enough, so you can still turn the brake lever with a bit of extra force. Why? If you ever crash and the bike falls on the brake lever just rotates away, protecting the handlebar from damage. As tight as necessary, as loose as possible, one might say. Next comes the gear lever, and it's the same deal with the gear lever. Determine the optimal position by carefully rotating the gear lever until you can shift gears with the greatest comfort using just your thumb and forefinger without needing to twist or strain your fingers in any uncomfortable way whatsoever. Place the gear lever near the grip, extending outward to provide intuitive, comfortable, easy thumb access for a seamless ride. It really shouldn't be positioned or angled too far outward either, so that you can avoid pressing down uncomfortably on your thumb joint while using it. Now that we have taken care of adjusting the brake levers as well as the shifter, let's move on to discussing the handlebar remote controls, specifically those that operate the dropper post and the motor. It's really quite important, considering that you'll both most likely be using these units frequently. Whether it's to switch between different motor support modes or to lower and extend the saddle, these functions will be used quite often. It's crucial that the two units in front don't interfere with each other. It would be quite inconvenient if you're out on the trail and want to lower the seat post, only to accidentally press the remote controller instead. Ensure that the remote controller and dropper post remote maintain a bit of distance from each other while still remaining ergonomically easy and convenient to reach. Especially the remote controller for the motor, which is essentially the remote control for adjusting the motor assistance levels. This is also important because It needs to be used when you need the push assist. And if you need the push assist, you generally need to keep a specific button pressed, most often the minus button on almost all systems, to effectively activate and maintain it. It's crucial for the remote lever to be set as low as possible, ideally in a specific kind of horizontal position, allowing you to comfortably press it with your thumb, making sure you don't have to do any awkward or uncomfortable movements to press the button. So, as I mentioned earlier, make sure to adjust the remote, properly align the dropper post, and position the motor in a way that they don't interfere with each other, all while being comfortably accessible with your thumb. Finally, let's talk about the e-bike display. The display should be positioned and adjusted in such a manner that when you're seated on the bike, you can easily and comfortably view it. It should be set up to prevent any uncomfortable glare or reflections caused by the angle. So this means you're actually viewing the display from an angle of roughly 90 degrees. And that wraps up everything we have to discuss about configuring the cockpit of your bike. So first, we centered the handlebar in the middle and then aligned it correctly in its angles so that the handlebar's backward bend points backward and the upward bend points upward, and then we firmly secure the handlebar appropriately into place in the stem. In order to fine-tune the cockpit height, spaces need to be positioned strategically either above or below the stem. After completing this step, ensure the stem is precisely aligned and perfectly centered straight with the front wheel. Once everything is set up, come the brake levers and the gear shifter, followed by the remote controllers for the motor and seat post, and finally the display. I hope this video helped you. And now one last note at the very end for everyone who's been wondering why there's a YT decoy standing next to me the whole time. Yes, at Ebike, we carry a wide variety of high-performance brands in our range, so you should definitely take some time to browse through our online shop and let yourself be pleasantly surprised. What fascinating and interesting models you might come across there. For instance, check out this exciting YT decoy. Until next time, I'm looking forward to seeing you, your Maxi from Ebike. If e-bike, then Ebike.